December 19th, 1944. St. Aude, Belgium. 10:30 at night. The temperature was 7 degrees. The snow was a foot deep, and inside a cluster of canvas tents 8 miles west of Bastogne, men in bloody scrubs were trying to save lives. The 326th Airborne Medical Company had arrived that morning after an all-night drive from France. They were the 101st Airborne Division's field hospital, and they had set up fast. Tent poles in frozen ground, lanterns lit, equipment unpacked. By 11 o'clock, they were already receiving casualties from the regiments fighting around Bastogne. Litters coming in one after another. Men with shell fragments in their chests, compound fractures, frostbite so severe the toes came off with the boot. Captain Willis McKee, 31, from Cincinnati, Ohio, was the senior medical officer on site. He'd been doing this since Normandy. He knew what a hospital in the field looked like, and he knew what a safe rear area looked like. This was supposed to be the second one. The Red Cross markings were everywhere. White panels on the tent roofs, Red Cross flags on poles outside. The vehicles parked in a row alongside the tents, each had a large red cross painted on the hood. It didn't matter. At 10:30 p.m., German armored vehicles from the 116th Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion came through the darkness from the northeast. They weren't lost. They had bypassed the American lines hours earlier, pushing west, looking for roads, looking for a route to the Meuse River. What they found instead was an aid station hospital. They opened fire, machine guns first, sustained 15 minutes of continuous fire into tents marked with red crosses. The canvas walls offered nothing. The lanterns inside turned the tents into targets. Silhouettes of nurses and medics and wounded men on litters, all of it visible from outside. Corporal Thomas Aikman, 22, from Nashville, Tennessee, was carrying a litter when the first rounds came through the tent wall. The man on the litter beside him was hit. Aikman hit the ground, crawled, and tried to drag the litter behind him. The man on it was already dead. He kept crawling anyway, because crawling was the only thing his body knew to do. Private First Class Henry Sullivan, 19, from Rochester, New York, was outside when the firing began. He didn't make it. He was the only man killed in the initial attack, but the word "only" doesn't carry enough weight. He was a medic. He was unarmed. He was 19 years old, standing beside a vehicle with a red cross painted on the hood. By midnight, it was over. The Germans had surrounded the site. The tents were riddled. Equipment was destroyed. And 130 Americans, 11 officers and 119 enlisted men, were prisoners of war. That included the doctors, the surgeons, the men the wounded soldiers of the 101st Airborne were counting on. One officer escaped. Captain Jacob Pearl, 28, from New York City, got out during the chaos and made it back to Bastogne on foot through the snow. At the 501st Parachute Infantry's aid station, he found the regimental surgeon and told him what had happened. The regimental surgeon looked at him for a moment, then picked up the field telephone. The message moved fast. By 06:30 the next morning, it had reached division headquarters. By mid-morning, it was at Corps, and within hours of that, it was on a desk at 3rd Army Headquarters, on General George S. Patton's desk. Patton was already deep in the most complicated operation of his career. 3 days earlier, at a conference at Verdun, he had promised Eisenhower he could disengage his entire army from its eastward advance, pivot 90 degrees north, and drive to relieve Bastogne in 48 hours. Everyone in the room had thought he was bluffing. He wasn't. His staff was moving 250,000 men and all their equipment in freezing weather, across roads that hadn't been designed for that kind of weight. His artillery was repositioned. His supply lines were bending into new shapes. The whole Third Army was turning like a massive wheel in the dark. And Patton was at the center of it, making it happen. And now this. He read the report. He set it down. He read it again. Then he said something to his aide, Colonel Charles Codman, that Codman later wrote down almost word for word. A Red Cross hospital. Marked, lit. They knew exactly what it was. He pushed back from his desk. Get me the intelligence on the 116th Panzer. Stories like this one, the ones that happened in the worst nights of the worst winter of the war, are the ones that tell you what this war was really about. If you want to hear them, subscribe. We find them, we research them, and we tell them right. What Patton already knew about the 116th Panzer Division was not reassuring. It was a veteran formation. It had fought on the Eastern Front, had been rebuilt after severe losses, and had been transferred to the West, specifically for the Ardennes offensive. Its commander was Major General Siegfried von Waldenburg, a professional soldier who knew the laws of war, which meant the men who attacked that hospital either acted without orders or received orders that should have stopped them and didn't. Either way, it was a war crime, clear, documented, witnessed, with survivors and a captain who had walked back through the snow to tell the story. Patton's intelligence officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, was the one who had been tracking the 116th Panzer's movements in the Ardennes. Koch, 46, from St. Louis, was widely considered the best intelligence officer in the American Army. He had been the one who warned, before anyone else, that the Germans were massing in the Ardennes for a major attack. Nobody had listened. He was right anyway. Koch brought Patton everything he had on the 116th. Its axis of advance, its estimated strength, its current position. The reconnaissance battalion that had attacked the hospital was part of a spearhead pushing west toward the Meuse. They had been moving fast, bypassing resistance, and the hospital had simply been in the way. Paused after laying out the map. Sir, they sustained fire for 15 minutes on a clearly marked facility. They couldn't have been confused about what it was. Patton looked at the map. No, he said, they couldn't. The international conventions are explicit. Medical facilities, medical personnel, the wounded under care, all protected. This is not a gray area. I know what the conventions say. Patton put his finger on the map, on the route the 16th had taken west from the German lines. They came through here. Yes, sir. And they're heading here. His finger moved, which puts them between my advancing columns and Bastogne. Lay nodded. He understood what Patton was doing. Not just processing the outrage, calculating. Get me General Gaffey, Patton said. Major General Hugh Gaffey, 51, from Connecticut, commanded the 4th Armored Division. The unit Patton had selected to lead the relief drive toward Bastogne. The 4th Armored was Patton's best. He had built it from the ground up, had pushed it across France faster than any armored formation in history. Its men were tired, and its tanks were worn, but they moved. Gaffey arrived at Patton's command post within the hour. Patton didn't open with strategy. He opened with the hospital report. He read it aloud to Gaffey. All of it. PFC Henry Sullivan, 19. The 15 minutes of fire, the 130 prisoners, including all the doctors the 101st Airborne had left. The tents with red crosses that burned while the guns were still firing. Gaffey listened without speaking. When Patton finished, he set the report down. Hugh, he said, I want you to understand something before we talk about the route to Bastogne. Sir, the men in Bastogne right now, the men we're going there to relieve, they're doing it without medical support. Their hospital is gone. Their doctors are prisoners. Their wounded are being treated in a convent, and a barracks, and whatever else they can find, by 2 medical officers and 113 enlisted men instead of a full company. He paused. That happened because the 116th Panzer decided a red cross painted on a tent was not a reason to stop shooting. Gaffey said nothing. His jaw was tight. I want the 4th Armored to move tomorrow, Patton said. And I want you to understand that we are not just going to relieve a siege. We are going to answer for what was done to that hospital. The answer is speed. The answer is weight. The answer is getting there before more men die, because they have no surgeons. He put his finger back on the map. The 116th Panzer is somewhere in this sector. Your route to Bastogne goes through the country they're operating in. I'm not asking you to hunt them down. I'm asking you to move fast enough that they become irrelevant. I want to get to those men in that town before another night passes the way the last one did." Gaffey looked at the map. The road to Bastogne was 60 miles of frozen Belgian countryside, 2 rivers, and whatever German formation stood in the way. "What's the weather forecast?" Gaffey asked. "Overcast, no air support." Gaffey looked up. "Sir, 60 miles in this weather, without air through 3 German formations?" "I know," Patton said. "That's why I'm sending you." Gaffey's 4th Armored Division moved out the following morning, December 20th. But Patton wasn't finished with the hospital report. He drafted a formal communication to the Judge Advocate General's office and to the Army's War Crimes Investigation Section. It was 2 pages, single-spaced, and it named the 116th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion by designation, described the attack in specific detail, cited the exact articles of the Geneva Convention that had been violated, and demanded that the responsible individuals be identified for prosecution. He wasn't putting it in a drawer. He was starting a paper trail that would outlast the battle. His aide, Codman, asked him about it later. They were in the command car moving between positions. "Sir, with everything happening right now, the breakout, the supply situation, is this the right moment to pursue a war crimes filing?" Patton looked out the window at the snow. That private who was killed, Sullivan, he was a medic. He wasn't armed. He was 19 years old, and he was standing next to a vehicle with a red cross on the hood. He paused. "If we don't write it down now, it gets lost. If it gets lost, the men who did it go home, and nothing happens to them." He turned from the window. "Write it down," he said, "while the witnesses are alive, while the evidence is there. Whatever happens in the next 2 weeks, we write it down." Codman wrote it down. December 26, 1944. Midnight. The first tank from the 4th Armored Division broke through the German lines south of Bastogne at 16:50 that evening. 6 days later, Patton had looked at the hospital report and told Gaffey to move 60 miles in 6 days through 3 German formations, 2 rivers, frozen roads, and no air support. The corridor into Bastogne was 100 yards wide, but it was open. The first vehicles through were not tanks. They were ambulances. Patton had ordered it specifically. Before any supply trucks, before any reinforcements, ambulances. The men inside Bastogne had been treating casualties for 7 days with almost no medical support. The loss of the 326th had gutted their capability right at the moment it was needed most. For a week, 2 medical officers and what remained of their enlisted staff had been operating in a convent by candlelight, in temperatures that froze the plasma before it could be administered. When the ambulances rolled through that corridor, the men in the convent heard them first. The engine sound coming from the south, the direction they'd been watching for 6 days. The 4th Armored's Medical Battalion brought plasma, penicillin, surgical instruments, and 3 surgical teams. They had anticipated the need. The wounded inside Bastogne had been stacking up faster than they could be treated, and they couldn't be evacuated because there was nowhere to send them. By midnight of the 26th, surgeries were happening that had been waiting for 6 days. Patton visited Bastogne on December 30th. He went to the makeshift hospital in the convent on Rue du Vivier. He walked through the wards, which were classrooms and chapels now full of cots. He stopped at each one. He didn't speak much. He looked at the men, nodded, moved on. One of the medics who was present, Technical Sergeant Raymond Gebhardt, 27, from Pennsylvania, described it afterward. He said Patton moved slowly, which was unusual. Most generals in those situations moved quickly. A brief appearance, a few words, done. Patton stopped at every cot. At one point, he stopped at the cot of a man who was unconscious, badly wounded, being kept alive by plasma. He stood there for a long moment, Then he said quietly to the medical officer beside him, "Who's this man?" "Private First Class David Carr, sir. 327th Glider Infantry. Came in 3 days ago." "What are his chances?" The medical officer paused. "Better now than they were yesterday, sir." Patton nodded, moved on. Before he left, he stopped the commanding officer of the improvised hospital, one of the 2 medical officers who had held the thing together for 7 days without a full company, a captain named Gerald Pryor, 34, from Massachusetts. Pryor was exhausted in the way men get when they've operated past the edge of what their body was designed to endure. He had circles under his eyes that looked like bruises. Patton looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "You know what happened to your hospital people?" "Yes, sir, I know. They're prisoners. The Germans have them. When this is over, we'll get them back." He paused. "What you did here for 7 days, with what you had, that's going to be in the record." Pryor said something that Gebhardt, who was standing nearby, wrote down later. He said, "Sir, we just did the job." Patton looked at him. "Most men can do a job under normal conditions. What you did wasn't a job. It was something else." He didn't say what something else was. He didn't need to. The war crimes documentation Patton had ordered began in January. Investigators interviewed survivors of the hospital attack as soon as they could be located. Captain Jacob Pearl, who had escaped through the snow, gave a formal deposition. Corporal Aikman gave his. The after-action report from the 326th Medical Company became part of the evidence file. The 116th Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion commander was identified. Post-war proceedings were initiated. The trail Patton had started on December 20th. "Write it down while the witnesses are alive," became part of the formal war crimes investigation record. The 130 members of the 326th Airborne Medical Company, who had been taken prisoner, were liberated at the end of the war. Most came home. The unit was rebuilt and returned to service. Private First Class Henry Sullivan, 19, from Rochester, New York, was the one who didn't come back. He was buried at the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium, Section B, Row 4. His mother received a telegram in January 1945. She didn't know until much later what the circumstances were, that he had been killed beside a vehicle with a red cross on it, in a field hospital that was marked on all 4 sides in the middle of the night. When she eventually learned the full story, she gave an interview to a Rochester newspaper in 1946. She was asked what she thought when she heard what had happened. She said, "I thought about what Henry told me before he left. He said medics don't carry guns. He said their job is to be clearly unarmed, clearly marked, and trust that the other side will respect that. He believed that." She paused. He was right to believe it. What happened to him was wrong. He was right and they were wrong, and that doesn't change. She was asked if she knew that General Patton had ordered a war crimes investigation. She said she had been told. She was asked what she thought of that. "I think it means someone was paying attention," she said. "When the worst things happen, the question is whether anyone is paying attention, whether anyone writes it down. General Patton wrote it down. That matters." The Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, lasted until January 25, 1945. When it ended, the German army had lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and any realistic hope of reversing the course of the war. The 4th Armored Division, which had driven 60 miles through frozen Belgium to break the siege at Bastogne, was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation. Patton was the architect of that drive. But the thing he did on December 20th that didn't make the front pages, that 2-page memorandum to the war crimes investigators, the order to write it down while the witnesses were alive, that was its own kind of answer. Not the loudest one, not the most dramatic one, but the one that lasted.